Alright, here we are back again. Now this is also from 2020. It's called Agriculture, the One True Currency. Throughout history, the wealth of nations has primarily been defined by how much food they could easily produce, thus leaving themselves time to study and develop technological advances over other nations, as well as trade extra food for extra wealth. Despite the fact that it is popular in the modern era to speculate on stocks, and even real estate, and that in the minds of the majority wealth is linked to paper bills of promise, these things, and even gold and diamonds, have only imaginary value. They cannot feed, clothe, or bring warmth directly. Thus, like a painting, their value lies only in as much as the society's ability to enjoy leisure will give it. And I think that's when people come together and they agree that something has a certain value by consensus, but it doesn't actually necessarily have that value in the real world. Okay, sort of by a vote by consensus, if you like. Obviously, it's easy to understand how paper money doesn't have much of a value unless you need to use it for kindling to start a fire. That's more like the real value of something. What can you actually use it for? As a product. Anyway, indeed, it remains a fact that first world nations of today are primarily defined by those nations' ability to not only feed themselves but other poorer nations as well. And of course, these days, these super rich nations like America are changing to a different kind of business model where they don't actually produce anything. They get other nations, third world nations, to produce food and other products, and then they buy it from them at a very low cost, because quite often they'll own the production or have a large investment in the production or farm system from overseas. And as you might know if you watch a few YouTube videos, farms are becoming a new investment as real estate becomes less viable as an investment. This maybe reflect the kind of uncertainty of the times, because people are kind of thinking that if they own a farm produces food's always going to have value. But in the reality is, when they invest in these farms, apparently this is what I can understand from these YouTube videos these guys are talking about, people who are kind of critique agriculture and the way it's run. This is even on mainstream media, you can see documentaries and such, basically saying that creating a monoculture of food, which leaves the food production vulnerable to pests and such, because the single kind of food being produced may not have the variety to adapt to any disease, which is common throughout history in crops. And of course, with the pesticides, they believe they're actually creating superbugs. The real question is why does no one do anything about that? And that's, I think I might have said before, at a certain point in a civilization, the destiny of that civilization is wrested from the hands of the civilization itself. And it's basically travels by momentum until it either crashes or is taken over or just collapses. A history is a cycle that repeats itself. And our civilization is no different. I was watching a financial guy on YouTube, and he said basically that no one in real estate ever believes that the real estate situation is ever going to change. They think this is it. This is how it always is. Prices will always go up, even though that's ridiculous. At the current rate of price rises, in 10 years, just for example, you might have a house worth $500,000 worth, let's say $50 million. And, it's unsustainable because real estate's become this investment. The real value of real estate only reflects not its location or the grandeur of the house even, but rather the actual functionality of that property. How functional is it to produce something? Okay. And I guess that's why investors are trying to invest in agriculture and farmland. But this farmland, you have to remember, is simply land that they artificially causing to be fertile. It may not necessarily be naturally fertile land like in the third world. So, for agriculture to be genuinely valuable, it has to be sustainable naturally, in my opinion, and it has to be hardened against different kinds of weather and such. The agriculture, the food that's being produced by the agriculture now might not meet that kind of level of safety of hardening against disaster, simply because it's all artificial. But this is typical. You can read in ancient Babylon, ancient Sumeria, they made vast areas of land arable for all sorts of crops by making canal systems. But what happened was the water they were using on the canals eventually raised the salt level on the land, and even now to this day in the Mesopotamia you can see massive areas of completely barren land where the salt has destroyed that land, so it can never really be used for agriculture again unless you was to dig it out, dump the soil, and then put other soil there in a massive operation, which is it's not necessary because people can just go somewhere else to grow their crops. So another example is the Aztecs. So I can't remember who, they put lime on their temples and ziggurats because it looked fantastic, but to produce the lime, the lime, they'd use kind of slash and burn agricultural technique, which eventually caused, may have been one of the causes that the cities themselves were abandoned, because they were no longer able to produce the food needed for the people to live in a kind of a city type situation. Also could have been linked to a drought, but in any case, a drought is something that it's almost impossible to harden yourself against with agriculture, but we're doing it now. There's been like a massive global drought for a long time, and in places where we live, on the Atlantic coast in Canada, the land here isn't good for agriculture anyway. So they bring it from Ontario in Canada and so on. But the reality is, if they didn't have transportation like they do now, they wouldn't be able to do that, and you'd have to have a much smaller population, which kind of brings it down to the main point, is that the population centers now aren't sustainable with locally grown agriculture, which is how population centers should be designed to harden themselves against disasters, right? Because if some kind of disaster happens and you can't transport in food, you want the people in that city to be able to go out and grow the food. So traditionally, you'd have a population center, buildings and such, and then surrounding that you'd have arable land, and the size of the population within that city center or township would depend on how much arable land directly surrounded it, which is the ultimate hardening of infrastructure in a society and civilization. And in this case, food has its absolute and real value. But the more you spread the agriculture from the city centers using advanced forms of transportation, the less real the value of the agriculture becomes, because in order to actually get that food to people, you have to use systems that are not hardened against disaster. So for example, just to illustrate my point, the ultimate kind of hardened infrastructure against disaster would be in the third world, where people are directly growing their food or going to a local market to get their food. And of course, in drought and flood they are affected. But the effect of those effects is you have smaller relatively population centres. Now, of course, even in third world countries, they have mega cities now. So basically, if you want to look at it in a certain way, our civilization in today's world, even in the third world, is like a survival knife edge. It just takes one calamity to completely destroy the entire global system on every level. And that's kind of an inevitability. When it will happen, no one really knows. But that it will happen, people generally believe to be the case. And anyway, that's you could say a lot more on that. I'll move on to my next blog now. Oops, there we go.